Thank you very much. Well, as you've heard from Olivier, the retrograde approach to renal stones is really on the rise. But do we see any problems with this procedure? Do we see any problems with going retrogradely? Well, this is from the recent guidelines of the EAU, just showing the potential, showing the complications of the ureterorhinoscopy. And this is from the biggest series in the world, I think, published by the group from Romania, Petrița Givelet. And as you can see, there are not many complications, but we do see complications, and we do see serious complications such as ureteral avulsion, urosepsis, and so on. But let us look into details when we see these complications. When do we see these complications? This is, of course, what we don't want to see. This is a publication from a Brazilian group with ureteral avulsion that was made good again with a interception of gut here. But this is a very brave and honest publication, and I'm sure in centers in which you are doing a lot of retrograde procedures, you will see complications like this. It should, of course, be very seldom, but it is seen. This publication looked into the predictive factors of complications during ureteroscopy, and what they found was clearly that complications, serious complications such as ureteral perforation, also ureteral avulsion, was correlated to the mean operative time. So in other words, the longer you stay in the ureter, the higher the complication rate. And as we have just heard from Olivier, we are treating bigger and bigger stones, and I think it's naive to think that we will not have higher complication rates because we are staying longer and longer time in the ureter. So how can we prevent this? Well, in my mind, complications to ureterorhinoscopy is either correlated to the access or irrigation. In other words, it has to do with ureteral tone and intraluminal pressure. So pressure has something to do with it. This is a CT that was made just after a retrograde intrarenal stone procedure. And what you can see is that you have nephromegalia that is due to intrarenal backflow, and you have perirenal stranding, just as you see in an acutely obstructed kidney due to a ureteral stone. That's what you see after a ureterorhinoscopy, and this is due to pelvic lymphatic backflow and pelvic venous backflow. So complications to the upper urinary tract, endoscopy seems to be related to the intraluminal pressure and the ureteral tone. This is from a recent study that we did. We measured the intraluminal pressure during ureterorhinoscopy. And what you can see is that the mean baseline pressure is around from 0 to 10. However, when you are doing ureterorhinoscopy, you will have pressure peaks that comes way above 300 millimeters of mercury, especially when you're doing procedures with the laser or doing forced irrigation. Then the renal pelvis will contract, and the pressures will come up way above the limit of the intrarenal backflow threshold. And of course, this is why it's very important that these patients always is given prophylactic antibiotics, because you will always have a backflow to the system. So is it possible to reduce intraluminal pressure and ureteral tone during ureteroscopy, and if it is possible, you may reduce the complication rates. This study looked into the role of the access sheet, looking at the pressures in the upper urinary tract. It is from Duke University in US, from the Preminger group, and it was clearly seen that when they used ureteric access sheet, when they were working in the distal and the mid ureter and the renal pelvis, they were able to reduce the intraluminal pressure using the ureteric access sheet. Still, when they are working in the renal pelvis, the pressures were rather high above the threshold. But no doubt, when you're using access sheets, you may reduce intrarenal pressures, and that may be beneficial for the kidney. However, I've borrowed this video from the Pulse study. As you can see, when you're doing retrograde procedures, you might damage the ureter. And there's no doubt that we have been looking for smaller and smaller ureteroscopes, and now we are using bigger and bigger access sheets, and you may damage the ureter when you are placing the access sheet like this. You may have ureteral perforations with potential damage. I'm absolutely sure that at the moment when we are using bigger and bigger access sheets, we will have complications like this, and we will have a higher stricture rate on the long run if we don't take care. So these access sheets should be placed without force. Because you have all experienced a narrow and spastic ureter that you couldn't pass with any scope or access sheet, and you shouldn't pass them forcefully, then you will have complications. However, after stenting, the scope and the access sheet could be easily passed. So obviously, it's not just that the lumen is not big enough, it has to do with the dynamics of the organ. Your ureter is not just a tube, it's a dynamic organ that is modulated with a lot of receptors. And as you can see from this slide, there has been a lot of studies going on, both experimentally and in humans, that have shown that there's a lot of receptors in the ureter, and you can modulate the activity of the organ by different drugs. For instance, there are a lot of drugs that contracts the ureter, and in this respect, we have looked at whether it is possible to relaxate the ureter, and we have used the beta-adrenergic agents. They are very potent relaxants of the ureter. First, we did a study using the rigid ureteroscope during semi-rigid ureteroscopy, and what we showed was that when you add isoproterenol, this beta agonist, to the irrigation fluid, you were able to shift the pressure flow curve to have the pressure flow curve go down in such a way that you can do your endoscopy at a much lower pressure. And we went on to do a randomized control study in the animal. And what we shown in which we used the flexible ureteroscopy, and we measured pressure in the upper urinary tract during flexible ureteroscopy. And when you added isoproterenol at a very low concentration in the irrigation fluid, you were able to do the endoscopy at a much lower pressure. We went further to do studies in humans, and this was published in the Scandinavian Journal of Urology a few years ago. And what we shown that when we used this very low concentration of isoproterenol, 0.1 microgram per milliliters, there were no systemic adverse effect. The blood pressure was equal between the groups. It didn't affect the blood pressure. It didn't affect the pulse rate. However, in every individual, as you can see, the red ones when you irrigated with isoproterenol in this uncontrolled study, you had a lower pressure in the upper urinary tract. And this made us go on to do a randomized controlled study in a human randomized controlled study using this very low concentration during flexible ureteroscopy. And what you can see here is that also in this randomized control study, the pressures in the upper urinary tract during flexible ureteroscopy was much lower when you used isoproterenol. And this is a typical pressure curve from a patient in which, from this study. The upper curve showing a patient that was randomized in the first period to saline, and also in the second period to saline, and you can see these pressure peaks both during endoscopy, both after and before and after randomization. However, when you added isoproterenol in the second period of randomization, you can see pressure peaks before. However, these pressure in the upper urinary tract flattened out. So we concluded that the intraluminal administration of isoproterenol at this very low concentration may be an effective method to reduce pelvic pressure and urethral tonus during ureteroscopy without cardiovascular side effects. And it may be a possible way of reducing complication and facilitating the procedures, and also making the retrograde procedure in these very big stones more safe, maybe. And we are now doing randomized, we are in the process of doing randomized controlled trials using this iso-irrigation during therapeutic procedures. For instance, in the cases where you cannot place a ureteral access sheath, this may be facilitated by this intraluminal drugs, and there are other drugs that is on the way that I know. So this may be a way. So I will conclude that intraluminal pressures during ureteroscopy will play a role in the future, because we are doing more and more endoscopic procedures retrogradely, and we are staying a longer time in the ureter. And one way to go is to use access sheets, because it has been shown to reduce intraluminal pressures. However, it does not reduce ureteral tone, and it has potential harmful effect. On the other hand, we may, in the future, shift to using intraluminal drugs in the irrigation fluid in order to reduce intraluminal pressure, and it also reduces ureteral tone, and it may be beneficial on special indications, for instance, when you cannot pass the scope and when you cannot pass the ureteral access sheet, and if you want to stay in the ureter treating a very big stone. So thank you, and I would just advertise for this meeting, September next year in Copenhagen. We will have our second biannual meeting of the EAU section of URS, and you are all cordially invited to the city of Copenhagen. Thank you.